So, first of all, has this budget broken Britain?
No, but it might have broken the Conservative Party. So the budget has basically implemented a large set of tax cuts to sort of phase in over the next year or so, and a major sort of round of spending on support for people's energy prices. A lot of this was announced in advance. I think about 38 billion of the tax cuts and of course the spending on energy prices was pre-committed, so markets knew about this. We got an extra 7 billion or so in surprise tax cuts on the day. And then we have this very interesting response where sterling fell quite sharply, was low for a few days, and then sort of picked back up. And this is surprising because usually when the government basically says we're going to run something of a large deficit, you'd actually expect the currency to appreciate because you sort of think the central bank will raise interest rates, which attracts in sort of overseas money, looking to sort of find the return on its investment. And that should sort of increase sterling mechanically. That's what happened in America with Reaganomics in the 80s. So it's something of a surprising reaction. And I think the bulk of it has basically been this... I don't want to call it an overreaction because markets are smarter than I am, obviously. But I think
they're not political as such, are they?
I think that's it. So I believe what sort of has happened here is they knew that Truss was going to do these tax cuts. They knew that Truss was going to do this spending. But there was some sense that what was going to be revealed in this mini-budget would be more detail on how it would be paid for. And obviously that's not really been forthcoming. So they're sitting there saying...
Because it was a mini-budget.
Exactly. And it's going to come in November with the actual formal budget. So we've had this sort of sudden shock to the system in that they thought they were going to get more detail than they got. They didn't get it. And now they're sitting there going, well, it's one thing to maybe borrow for that 200 billion LNG support package because that's a one-off. You can borrow for those. You don't want to make a habit of doing it, but you can sort of spread those costs over time. If you're borrowing to fund permanent tax cuts, because these tax cuts will not raise enough revenue to pay for themselves, I don't think anyone really expects them to in the government. That's a bit more worrisome. However, to the best of my knowledge, and from putting things together that I've read in the press and what I've read in the government documents, the plan, as I see it, is to find ways of growing the economy. That's why it's called the growth plan. And so if they can come out with policy measures which increase GDP enough to pay for these, I think you want to find about 5% over the next 5 to 6 years, then a lot of the worries sort of dissipate. But it's very hard to do that, not because it's hard to find policies that would do it. There are things which would increase growth massively, planning and liberalisation, number one, but it can be hard to get them through Parliament. And the danger of sort of giving a tax cut first is you might have some Conservative backbenchers who are tempted to basically bank it and say, well, we got the tax cuts now, that's going to increase growth, right? We don't need to do the hard work of persuading our constituents to let lots of homes be built. But you sort of, that's the sort of failure mode of this, if you will.
And it doesn't address the elephant in the room, which is high government spending. And, of course, austerity is now politically unpalatable.
So I think if you got the economic growth, you wouldn't actually need to make cuts to spending. That's the wonderful thing about it. I think this is constantly underestimated. If you have a larger economy, you can have more of everything. But the one thing I will say is that the case for being optimistic about them getting some of these growth-oriented reforms through is that they're now 30 points behind Labour in the polls. So Truss can basically turn around and say, if you want to win the next election, you better have that economy growing because that's going to be what gets us over the line. So she sort of put a gun to the party's head and said, vote for the rest of the reforms or collapse into turmoil and lose to summer.
The bottom line is that this mini-budget may have seen off a deep recession for the UK. And don't you think that if the Eurozone slips into a deep recession, America elsewhere, and Britain has a shallow recession or no recession, she'll go from zero to hero?
I don't think there's enough fiscal stimulus in the mini-budget to offset a recession. I mean, so the energy price thing will definitely sort of limit the economic damage done. I think that's entirely true. So to that extent, you're sort of cushioning what would have been a very hard winter for businesses. So yes, you have that. But it's going to be interesting seeing what's happening across Europe because it's worth noting that a lot of other European governments, Germany in particular, are starting to look at rolling out price caps of their own. And if everyone sort of rolls out price caps at the same time, you just end up with governments bidding against each other.
There's talk about the Germans intervening to the tune of 200 billion euros in their own economy this winter. And they have a winter energy crisis. Of course, they're so reliant on Russian gas. What about interest rates? Are they a worry?
I mean, they're definitely going to go up because you're sort of, if you are going to borrow more money, which I think they probably are, they won't pay for all of this with spending cuts simply because the package is so large. You would expect interest rates to rise. I think right now, this sort of the long-term yield has risen by about half a percentage point from where it started last Friday, maybe 1%. So the market's expecting an increase in interest to sort of offset any potential increase in inflation, and I think that's But I think that's the cost of doing business. Yeah.
But I'm all for go for growth, and I've been largely supportive, like you actually, that the principles of the budget, maybe not all of the execution or the communication, but I think the idea of making the economy bigger is a virtuous circle. We all win. I don't think it's trickle-down economics. I think it's trickle-up. But the issue we've got is whether interest rates get so high that they impact household budgets, at which point all of that good work is undone.
I wouldn't say it's undone, because what will basically be happening is the interest rates will be going up to offset the increase in demand sort of pushed into the economy by the budget, so that it should sort of net out roughly even.
Sure, but if they hit sort of 5, 6, 7%, I mean, that's going to break thousands of families, isn't it?
That would
and suck disposable income out of people's wallets.
If they went to 7%, I think a lot of people would have trouble with their mortgages. But it would be interesting to see where market expectations are leading right now. I mean,
Patrick Minford, the architect of Trussonomics, told me on Dan Wootton's show last night, sitting in for Dan, that actually he's not sure that interest rates will have to go that much higher, and that inflation is falling away. And by the way, are we not getting our knickers in a twist about this support for energy bills, given the fact that energy costs are tumbling globally? The price of energy is coming down. There's some suggestion, there was a fear it could cost, 100, 150 billion? By the summer of next year, it could be down to very little, couldn't it?
So I'm actually quite a critic of the energy bill support. I think they've basically found a policy which is potentially extremely expensive, and it's that element of risk which markets really don't like.
Yes, because it's unlimited liability, isn't it?
It's unlimited liability, and what's more, you're going to be in a bidding war against other European governments. I should say as well, I'm not actually the biggest fan of the tax cut package in and of itself. I think it's, so long as you do the growth stuff, that's what matters. It's not, this is all well and good, but it's not all well and bad, as the case might be. It's not what matters. What matters is that you get through the pro-growth reforms for planning and for the other parts of the economy. If you do that, you can pay for these cuts, everything comes out broadly okay. If you don't do those, or you don't do them sufficiently, and you can't pay for these cuts, then what's going to happen is in about 2 years' time, you're going to find you need to raise taxes again, cut spending, or face Labour doing it for you.
What's going to happen, do you think? Where will we be? It's going to be a tough winter, isn't it? Where do you think we'll be in the spring and summer of next year, inflation-wise, interest rates-wise? What do you reckon?
I would expect inflation to still be high. We're not going to be resolving the energy crisis in the very short term. I think sort of Q3 next year is the period when the IMF and other sort of organisations think it will start coming down as we start getting more shipments of LNG from America into Europe. Interest rates would probably then remain high until that sort of calms down as well.
Because that's the thing, interest rates could come up, but they can fall as well, can't they? Which is why perhaps people shouldn't rush into going for a fixed rate when the standard variable is a bit flexible.
It's certainly, if I were going to get a mortgage now, actually, I'm not going to be able to give you financial advice.
No. Well, what would you do if it was you, if you were getting a mortgage for yourself?
If I could get a nice low rate, I would be locking that one in for the next few years.
Next few years. Brilliant stuff. Well, let's open up the conversation, because the housing market has taken a hit, with reports that at least 1,600 mortgage products have been removed from the market since the Chancellor's mini-budget. And if you do have a mortgage, soaring interest rates could make them unaffordable. To discuss the current feeling, we're going to add to the mix top estate agent and branch manager at Carl Tatler on the Wirral, near Liverpool, of course, Joe Pollard. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Mark. How are you? You okay?
I'm very well. Good to have you on the show. That was a week to forget for you, wasn't it?
It's been an interesting time, but probably on the overall a little bit more positive than I think people might imagine, as much as there are complexities to the entire process, and obviously some slightly self-fulfilling prophecies from the media. Actually, if you look at the appetite in the marketplace, it's probably stronger than people might realise. And actually, when they're seeking good advice, mainly from good mortgage advisors and things like that, then actually, as much as maybe it would be easy for the media to maybe paint a very morbid picture, it's actually been, as a company, and probably speaking to some of our counterparts, a harder time than it has been, but it's followed essentially 2 years of very, very good times in the marketplace, and people have been very lucky to benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, to what extent has the withdrawal of mortgage products by various banks been a problem for buyers, Joe?
I think it's only really been a very short-term problem. I mean, in the marketplace where it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about the the mortgage marketplace being essentially the largest that it had ever been, with sort of 13,000 products, sort of 12 months ago. The fact that, say, 16 or 1,600 or 1,000 had maybe been withdrawn, and I was speaking to one of our trusted partners, those mortgage products that were withdrawn in the short term, the majority are actually already back on the marketplace, a significant amount. And essentially, those mortgages that were withdrawn were rate changes that were basically applicable to the news that was given last Friday. So more of a case of going, right, well, actually, we have to fall in line with what we believe is going to happen. Those mortgage rates have been withdrawn. They've been products that have been withdrawn from the available marketplace, not really ever withdrawn from people that are after the point of a mortgage offer, which is very different from the initial application. It's going to cost people a little bit more, but those 1,600 products are probably half replaced pretty in the short term. And then actually, there are plenty of other products, a huge amount elsewhere for people to come onto. So actually, when you look at yes, it's not a great thing, but probably not as bad as people are making it out to be.
That's really interesting. And how are those long-term fixed rate products looking? Because that's what many will be looking for when they get into the housing market. They're looking for 2, 3 or 5 years, maybe even 10 years. Have they shot up, do we know?
And again, speaking to a trusted source of ours, really, what we would say is the majority seem to probably selecting slightly longer products with a view that I think we all believe, and it's probably practical to say, that those interest rates will continue rising for a brave while. And certainly, actually, something that myself and my wife have done very recently. We've just fixed our mortgage for the longest that we've ever taken a mortgage out for. Traditionally, we've always gone 2 to 3 years to say, okay, well, look, things might look good in the short future. Maybe we'll look at releasing a bit of equity or something like that. And I think the practicality of that means that we would probably look to fix the rate that we're on now in case it does go up, because actually a variable rate would be a pretty bad thing for a mortgage like ours and for most people. I would say that actually fixing it for 5 years, that payment is going out. Yes, it will be a little bit more expensive, but you're not worrying about it changing like a lot of other costs are. You go, right, well, that part of my money is assigned every single month without fail for 5 or 10 years. And again, yes, those rates are expensive, but if you spoke to a mortgage advisor, what they would say to you is, yeah, okay, it's a little bit more expensive, but not really as bad as some people might say to you. And if you couldn't really afford an extra £50, £100, £150, maybe with a little bit of tolerance, you'd maybe wonder about the practicality of buying a house at the time anyway.
Yes, for sure. And before I come back to Sam, Joe, can I ask you, what about talk of an imminent house market crash? The idea of a correction downwards of 10, 15 or 20% and thousands of repossessions. Is that wide of the mark as well from where you're standing?
If I look at the basics of what we as a company believe, the message would be much more positive than that. Essentially, it would make sense that there was some sort of correction. We've been talking probably about a pretty long-term house price rise over sort of 2.5 years, and certainly where I sit right now, we were at the thick edge of that in sort of late 2020, 21. We had 2 of the top 10 places in terms of price rises in the country. It would sort of make sense that actually, even if 5% did come off these prices, that wouldn't be a huge burden for the local public. I think if you start talking about 10 and 15%, it gets to a point where people stop selling their houses completely. And the thing to remember is, with an ever-expanding population, demand and appetite for properties tends to probably keep the prices a little bit higher than I think certainly the 15-20%, which is what we saw in 2008. But yes, I suppose it would be fair to say maybe short-term losses, but over a period of time, certainly people that are fixing these long mortgages and not planning to go anywhere, then actually that becomes less of a problem. Repossessions can't be avoided, but that has to be a significant change in cost. And certainly if they are on fixed rate, they should know that money is coming. And it can be, people will need to tighten their belts, maybe a little bit lesser disposable income, but that's what people used to do to pre the very low levels.
back in the day. I mean, Joe, very briefly, if you can, the clock's against us. The government just can't let interest rates get to 6, 7, 8, 9%, can they? Because at that point, the housing market will be in trouble and the economy will simply fall over.
I think it would be very hard if the rates tended to get up to those types of levels. And again, it was a long time ago that those rates were at that type of level. I think we would then see the appetite, which we talked about before, the demand, I think would take a fairly significant drop. And at that point, I think those huge rates, I really do think we would probably struggle and you'd find a lot less people moving in the marketplace. But again, maybe not the huge drops in price, just it would just generally stagnate as far as we were concerned.
Picking up there on what Joe Pollard has had to say, Sam, it does seem that the press and indeed the international traders have rather whipped up a storm here, a bit of a storm in a teacup at this stage.
I wouldn't sort of refer to it in precisely that term, although I do think the media coverage kind of feeds into the markets and the markets feed into the media. So you end up with this sort of unvirtuous cycle, if you will, at times. But I think the initial movements were basically based off the lack of detail on how this is going to be funded, and I think possibly some degree of lack of faith that will actually get through the more meaningful growth reforms.
The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they're going to give this the once-over, aren't they? They're going to offer some findings, I think, in early October, in about a week's time, and then a full sort of overview in November. They're going to sign this budget off, and we'll be back to normal, won't we?
So the interesting thing about the OBR is that they're basically they're an independent body who sort of assesses the effect of these fiscal policy changes on the budget for Britain and on the deficit and the debt. So the thing I think which freaked people out was less the lack of information, because the Treasury was fairly clear about what they're going to be spending and why. But the fact that they'd said to the OBR, don't do this, sent quite a bad signal about what it might mean for the public finances. So the fact that they're going to be doing it, I think, will probably have some sort of calming effect, yeah.